now it's my pleasure to introduce Francis Shor, Professor Emeritus of Wayne State University, a history professor. And we all need to know the history behind this military-industrial complex and understand the mess we are in today with our budget. And so that's the theme today. And Francis Shor has written several books and many articles in journals and magazines. And he is also a peace activist with Peace Action, and also he's on the board of the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, and I just saw him, was it just last Sunday or 2 weeks? Just last Sunday, wow, 2 Sundays ago, with the Michigan Coalition of Human Rights dinner that was packed. I mean, probably 800 people there, and it seemed like, and here he is to really educate us. So get ready to go to college again, and please give a warm welcome to Francis Shor.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks in particular to Colleen Mills, who invited me here, and for the work that all of you do in this wonderful group. I'm going to be calling on Colleen to forward the slides because I don't have a little clicker up here that I can use to do that. So she'll be my clicker. I'll give her a prompt and then she'll be able to go. How many of you, I think all of us in the Peace Network are well familiar with the term, the military-industrial complex? And many of us may in fact know that that term originated with Dwight David Eisenhower. Actually, his speechwriter, Malcolm Moose, who was president of the University of Minnesota when I was going to the University of Minnesota, and we sat in his office during the Vietnam War. Threw that speech back at him, but anyhow. So Dwight David Eisenhower coined the phrase military-industrial complex. But of course, the military-industrial complex had been operating much longer than the phrase itself. In fact, I think we can point to the origins in World War II. And many of you may have had family members, people who participated either in the military, because 18 million people served during World War II. But remember, Detroit, right, was the arsenal of democracy. It was where the auto industry turned its lines over to the Defense Department, or then what was called the War Department, more correctly so, the War Department, in order to mount a massive campaign for generating war material. And this enormous collaboration then between the War Department and corporations had its origins in World War II. More importantly, and you may remember, one of the most significant activities during World War II was the coming together of the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was the basis for the origin of the atom bomb, bringing together scientists, the military, and corporations, all in massive collaboration. So the military-industrial complex can actually be traced to the enormous efforts in World War II to bring together war material and the corporate sector. Okay, let's go ahead to the next one, please. Yeah. Now, when we look back at Dwight Eisenhower's legacy, at that speech, which was his farewell address, by the way, one of the things that's particularly evident is that we've been in significant wars after wars after wars. And we're in a situation now where President Obama has talked about getting out of Iraq, getting out of Afghanistan, and we've still had military personnel being killed in Afghanistan and in Iraq because the war machine still goes on. Continuing, the next one. And here's part of Eisenhower's speech again, and I think it harkens back to a different sort of voice in Dwight Eisenhower. He oversaw the expansion of this military-industrial complex. He oversaw the expansion of a U.S. Imperial presence throughout the world. He oversaw the CIA overthrowing of democratically elected governments in Iran and in Guatemala. But at the same time, he came from the Midwest and came from a kind of populist sensibility that suggested the following. Every gun that is made, earlier Eisenhower told his audience, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. And I think one of the interesting things is Martin Luther King's famous address that many people heard, discussed, and read on April 4th, the anniversary of his assassination here in town. That famous Riverside address in 1967 talked about precisely the same thing. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And I think that's something we have to particularly keep in mind. It's not only a drain on the kind of expenditures that I'll highlight in this slideshow, so they'll let me know what's been lost of the trillions and trillions of dollars that have been squandered, but also what has soured our souls, so to speak, as a nation. Continuing. And here again, more of the Eisenhower Address. And I think that's particularly significant still. Continuing. Now here is Eisenhower being very specific, and we can talk about these specificities even today. Cost of one modern heavy bomber is this. A modern brick school in more than 30 cities. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. We know that even in the most recent budget of the Pentagon, that $150 million was spent on private villas for a handful of personnel in Afghanistan. $2.7 billion, which could be used for all kinds of wonderful things, like scholarships to public education for college students. Blowing $2.7 billion on an air surveillance balloon that doesn't work. So we know that the amazing amount of misprioritization that occurs with the military is particularly pertinent in Eisenhower's era and in ours. Continuing. Yeah, I mean, I think that, let's go to the next one. This is, all right, so what happens is, this was a decision actually that was made at the end of World War II. Right? You could have had a society that finally did what the New Deal wanted to do. what Harry Truman announced in 1947, 46. There were New Deal Democrats, and there's still pretty much of a New Deal Democrat today. It's called Bernie Sanders. But, politics in the Harry Truman called for universal health care. It wasn't crazy then. It wasn't crazy now. But instead, money was utilized from the budget to fuel the expansion of the military. And this is what's sometimes referred to as military Keynesianism. Keynes, Lord Maynard Keynes, was a British economist whose theories about how you rescue a capitalist society in the midst of depression would inform the New Deal. And basically what he said is you have to prime the pump, giving people money so they can put it back into the economy. So the use of the term military Keynesianism was related to this idea that wouldn't it be a good idea to put money into jobs for the military to prime the pump that way. The only problem is with those kinds of jobs, they do not have the same kind of multiplier effect on the rest of the economy. Moreover, as we can see with some of these weapon systems, how many people go out and buy an ICBM? Not many people. So it doesn't really have its utilization as consumerized. Let's keep on going. And again, America's disregarded warning. Yeah, this post-war boom, which didn't affect everybody, nonetheless did have a consequence that was rather interesting. Some of the very roads that we still travel today were built for security purposes. The expansion, that enormous expansion of the highway system was part of that overall plan for national security. And if we can continue. Now, the national security state is something that was with us not from Homeland Security, but it emerged particularly in the aftermath of World War II. And I want to cite one particular document that's very famous or infamous. It's called National Security Council Document 68. And it lays out a worldview that's based upon the kind of paranoia and fear that has been with us ever since. The objects of the paranoia and fear change, but the paranoia and fear remain. NSC 68 occurred in the aftermath of the explosion of a Soviet nuclear bomb and the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. So this document, as it emerged in 1950, was very alarmist and apocalyptic. We are in greater jeopardy than ever before in our history. And it proposed massive increases in defense spending, the development of a hydrogen bomb, increased security assistance to train and assist arms of friendly nations, who were often dictators, and enhance internal security, creating in this incredible rush a enormous fear and paranoia, both internally and externally. Internally, with the fear of communism, with the red baiting that went on during the late 40s and 50s, and externally with the fear that the Soviets were marching on to to Western Europe and eventually to the United States. And you may have remembered that from, if we don't stop the communists in Vietnam, we'll have to fight them on the beaches of San Diego. So, if you can continue. So here is that, again, that national security document, very alarmist, and you know, we've had various iterations of that over the year. The Committee for the Present Danger, there's a Committee for the New America. I mean, all of these sorts of things have been part and parcel of practicing that kind of fear and paranoia. We continue. Yeah, so I guess we can see it's more than just the military-industrial complex. It's the military-industrial congressional complex. And of course, the military clearly, in expanding its economic reach, managed to have extensive networks in every congressional district, so that any threat to the Pentagon would be potentially a threat for job losses. I want to recommend a book, that's what we do as professors, even retired ones, a book by Nick Terse called The Complex. It's a couple of years old, but it really highlights how extensive Pentagon contracts are, even for non-military weapons. So I think that's particularly important. Continuing. Yeah, and preparedness, another underlying issue. Continuing. I think here is one of the most brilliant social scientists that we produced in the last 20th century. And somebody that talked about military metaphysics, the cast of mind that defines international reality as basically military. You know, every option. There's a famous story, too, an anecdote that when Obama was asking for certain options in Afghanistan and Iraq, he said, how come they're giving me every one that's a military one? Well, that's how they operate. As Madeleine Albright said, Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, if we have this incredible military, why don't we use it as an indispensable nation? So the other thing that he talked about in conjunction with this was what he called crackpot realism. That's what rules Washington today. Crackpot realism. The idea that although ISIS is a reprehensible organization, that it is an existential threat to the United States is what Mills would call crackpot realism. Everybody, of course, has a way of turning their particular enemy at the time into Adolf Hitler from World War II. So you may remember even in Time magazine put a little extra mustache work on Saddam Hussein to make him look a little bit, Hitlerite. Again, not that these people are nice people, but the exaggeration in order to ramp up military response is a part and parcel of these military metaphysics. Continuing. Yeah, so very famous painting by Banksy, by the way, great artist. So, those of us who talk about peace, if we don't seriously dismantle the military-industrial congressional complex, entertainment complex, we have you know, an intractable foe in the sense that it's extremely difficult to make your points for peace if the populace feels constantly under siege. All right, and then here, of course, was the massive amount of nuclear warheads. And, you know, we haven't really completely cut back on nuclear warheads, right? We still have, I think it's, what, 15,000 maybe each?
In the world, 15,000, 7,000.
Yeah, and the United States being, the US and Russia being the two primary countries holding these nuclear stockpiles. And of course, it represented a kind of madness. I mean, literally, it was a madness of trying to create you know, some kind of mutually assured destruction. That was the term for mad, right? Mutually assured destruction. And anybody who ever talks about using a nuclear weapon is a lunatic. I mean, but of course, every single president has said, we're not taking any of our options off the table. Which means what? Which means you consider using nuclear weapons? Continuing. Yeah, and more of that extensive network. Continuing. And that was this notion of massive retaliations, thinking that this would be the centerpiece of the US doctrine, also from the National Security document, that the Soviet Union had to be defeated by any means necessary. Continuing. Yeah. He thought that this would somehow change the balance, but not exactly. Continuing. And that's part of that notion of military spending, again, being integral to the well-being of an economy. But of course, what really drove the economy in the 1950s and 60s was the expansion of consumer goods, the manufacturing in this country, the expansion of unions, the recognition of unions and of creating of a middle class. All of that really drove the well-being. Continuing. And of course, this was all part of an extensive network of keeping the Soviets at bay in the Cold War, as we knew it. Extensive numbers of bases. And I think one of the things that we know today is that we still have military bases in Germany and Japan. Yes?
How many overall worldwide?
Close to 1,000. And that doesn't count the warships. There are, 15 battle fleets, if I'm not mistaken.
And 15 atomic submarines.
Yeah. So this is still pretty extensive. Continue. Yeah, and of course, this is part of what happens with co-opting people into this military-industrial complex and feeling like this is their livelihood, and everything rides on continuing to promote that complex. Yes. Yeah, and of course, one of the things that happened is a lot of this, the campaign rhetoric, particularly in 1960, John F. Kennedy tried to go further to the right of Richard Nixon when he claimed that the Eisenhower administration was responsible for a missile gap, when in fact he knew there wasn't really a missile gap. But it was a piece of campaign rhetoric to show that somehow Nixon was soft on national security. Continuing. Yeah. So here you have this sort of schizophrenia of the public and private mind here. Continuing. Yeah, so it was on his departure from office, his farewell address, that he drove home this point about the military-industrial complex. Continuing. And this is, of course, the most famous of the phrases where the context for this. And I think we are still threatened as a democracy by the unwarranted influence. Continue. And I think it does still rest with us. We need to continue to play a citizen's role in calling to task what is out of just completely magnified military-industrial complex. Because we're not just talking about the budget for defense itself. We're talking about $700 billion in that. But we're talking about Homeland Security, we're talking about the VA administration, we're talking about the National Security Agency. I mean, all of that adds up to over $1 trillion. That's way more than 50% of the discretionary budget. And when they say, oh, we don't have any money, right? It's a lie. It's a lie. It's just that we appropriate money incorrectly. To give you an example of this, they often, President Reagan often liked to tout the fact that his supporters that we won the Cold War, right? As we drove the Soviet Union into self-destruction. But I would argue something else. I would argue that somebody else won the Cold War. Germany and Japan won the Cold War. Oh, what? How? Well, first of all, the United States spent trillions of dollars in Cold War military spending at the expense of infrastructure and research and development. During the 1950s and 1960s, 1/3 to 2/3 of all American research talent was siphoned off into the military sector. All of that talent going off, all that R&D work. Japan and Germany spent nothing on research and development for military. But they did spend a lot on electronics. They spent a lot on automobiles. And when it came time for the U.S. to be challenged in the 70s, they were right there, challenging, until the U.S. economy figured out a new way of reconfiguring the global capital system, namely under financialization, which came to a massive crash in 2008. And the reverberations are still with us today. But that was how they tried to recapture that position. Continuing on. And again, this is more of our need to step up. And here again is only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of huge industrial and military machinery of defense with peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together. And that's, again, more on Ike's final role here. And here was, as I mentioned earlier, Kennedy accusing falsely Nixon and the Eisenhower administration of the responsibility for a missile gap, and ginning up the military budget, continuing. Yeah, so here, one wonders what happened with the peace dividend when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, 1990. There was a new enemy. There was international terror. There was a global war on terror. And this has become another source for this misappropriation of money. Continuing. Yeah, and so the CIA continues to actually run some of the drone program. It's hardly anymore just an intelligence agency. It's been participating since Eisenhower's administration and before, with the emergence of the OSS in World War II, and then the parent of the CIA in the 40s. A variety of governments that have been overthrown. And of course, with Homeland Security now, that expansion is rooted in everyday life, whether it's the TSA at the airports or surveillance going on everywhere. It just reinforces that sense of paranoia and fear, which feeds into this military mindset. Continuing. Yeah, again, the National Security Administration, and there's a whole figure that's sometimes referred to as the black box, and the way in which money is funneled in to these programs and not completely accounted for. That's part of the problem. Sometimes we do auditing, and we know that the Pentagon still pays, $8,000 for $500 gears, or remember the old ones about the toilet seats costing tremendous money. But what's happening now is so many spin-offs have occurred to privatize the operation. So what happens is, where you used to pay a sergeant, or not a sergeant, a corporal, a private, to do to work the kitchen shift, you now pay Halliburton so much more money that as a private corporation it makes extensive money on just what were basic services provided by the military previously. Continuing. All right, there's one of those flow charts. It's sort of there are all these different command structures, right? The whole world is massively configured into a command structure, an African command structure, a Southern command structure. All of these things have been highly militarized. Many of the State Department functions are now highly militarized. When every problem is defined as a military nail, you need a military hammer to drive the nail in. Okay, continue. Yeah, just an interesting picture of. All right, here, of course, intelligence spending. We're not even sure of which part of that goes into the Department of State or the Department of Homeland Security. But again, there's even within the NSA, I think we know more about it because of Edward Snowden and other whistleblowers who have made clear how pervasive the invasion of privacy is in our lives. Yeah, it's almost 700 billion now. And of course, this is equal to like every other nation in the world. So if you add all other countries in the world, there are hardly any countries that have military bases outside of their territory. Right? The United States. And this amount of money, again, does not incorporate Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, Department of Energy, and on and on and on. It adds up to over $1 trillion. Continuing. Well, here's a more graphic presentation. There's the U.S., almost half of the military outlays of the world. And one wonders, right? Do we need this, and do we need empire? Chalmers Johnson, who wrote a number of really excellent books, often thought about the Roman Empire as a place where the liberty went to die, so to speak. And that may be a historical lesson for us to all remember. Continue. Yeah, so here you've gotten how many people are in active armed forces, how much the percentage of the GDP, but really we're talking more about the discretionary budget, and that's what is so apt when it comes to considering how we misappropriate money for things that we actually could use, like universal health care. Since every other country in the industrial world has it, even poorer countries like Cuba have it. Yeah. Continuing. And so there have to be additional justifications for Pentagon budgetary demands. Military metaphysics underlies them all, but still. Go ahead. Now this has been the Asian pivot, as it's called. We've been ramping up military exercises with the Philippines. Still have troops in Japan and Okinawa, even though the in Okinawa want those troops to go. There's other expansions going on, and of course, how would we feel if the Chinese decided to move into Mexico and do some military exercises in Mexico and surround the United States with their one big battleship, which they got from the Ukraine, as opposed to the 15 battleship fleets that we got. So, Yeah, so that's all part of that pivot to Asia. And of course, the idea is that terrorism is an idea. Right? It doesn't have command the military that the Nazi Germany did. And that this has been highly militarized too. Continuing. Here's, somebody we've forgotten as one of the, I know this is a loaded term, but I will have to use it as was a war criminal. You go with the army that you've got, you go with the military you've got, not fully equipping the troops are expecting the sort of guerrilla warfare that would occur that has damaged so many U.S. soldiers and left people with all kinds of post-traumatic stress disorders. But at the same time, they lied about the war and weapons of mass destruction. Anybody who bought into that argument has a serious judgmental problem. I won't go any further into that. So here was Rumsfeld talking about elevating threat. You remember these codes that we used to, I think we still have them, right? The orange code, the red code. And this was all part of ramping up the global war on terror. Continuing. Yeah, this was back in the 1940s when Truman was in office and people were war weary from World War II. The senator from Ohio told Truman he was going to have to scare the hell out of the American people to get them to continue on a war economy. And he found the excuse in what he believed was a Greek communist support by Stalin, when in fact Stalin was pulling back from Greece and trying to defend his own Eastern European perimeter pretty brutally, but very defensive in terms of what was going on. So it's not, scare the hell out of them is the same tactic. Yes. And of course, what happens is, as much as there's any effort to say people can't leave the military and go right into Lockheed Martin, Marietta, sorry, that's exactly what happens. General Dynamics, the same people you see coming out of the Pentagon, coming out of the Defense Department, are heading right into that revolving door of policymakers. But it doesn't just happen there in the military-industrial complex. It certainly happens in big pharma, in the health departments, the big ag, in the agricultural departments. It's the role of the corporate world in the total corruption of the political system in Washington. I think that's one of the things that fuels the anti-Washington, anti-corporate sentiment of some of the insurgent campaigns. Okay. Yeah, so here you get an example of former ranking hierarchies are now in suits and ties and in the corporate world. Continuing. And here's Mills again, a coalition of generals in the roles of corporation executives, of politicians masquerading as admirals, of corporation executives acting like politicians. So you get this is very vicious circle. Yeah. Remember how they embedded the journalists with the military? I mean, they learned something from Vietnam. In Vietnam, there wasn't too much effort to censor the news. And they could pretty much go everywhere. And although the official line that often was still broadcast by Walter Cronkite et al., you know, winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And they showed those pictures of guys getting, you know, killed, American troops getting killed. It was what was called cognitive dissonance. In other words, you had one message here going in orally and another message visually that's contradicted that. And it created the kind of anger, disassociation, and you know, sense of that Washington was lying. So, yes, continuing. Now what they've been doing is, you know, sort of embedding the journalists and showing them just kind of nice little pictures that they sanitize. But here's the great thing about the World Wide Web, is that people have been able to crack open some of these windows. So that very famous or infamous shot on Wikipedia of you know, of a U.S. helicopter pilot being told to light up these civilians, you know, just to and to even stop kids, somebody out there who was trying to rescue somebody else. I mean, this is what the military didn't want you to see, because they tried to sanitize and censor. And you remember during the Iraq War under Bush, they wouldn't even show body bags or military coming back. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, good question. We know we're in economic distress. We know that there's crumbling infrastructure. We know that there are lots of unaddressed social needs. And yet, there's always money for the military. Yeah. And of course, the arrogance and the belief that these things would be just a walk, an easy walk, right? Mission accomplished, remember? We're still in Iraq, still in Afghanistan. You know, that's what happens with military and imperial arrogance. Continue. Right, we're not in Star Wars. We actually don't know how to end it. Think about it. It's what? 2003 in Iraq. 2001 to 2002 in Afghanistan. Yeah, so, but, you know, part of it is that we have a volunteer military, or sort of a poverty trap. And a lot of it's just hidden from the mainstream corporate media, but you can find out plenty on the internet or read like Chalmers Johnson, Nick Turse, and Andrew Bacevich. Those are three names to remember. The cost now is estimated to be close to $3 trillion. When you take into account the veterans who are really suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and other issues. So, talk about a waste of treasure and lives. And that's not to count what has happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So, continue. Yeah, I don't even think either, under the best of circumstances, military Keynesianism worked precisely well because of the multiplier effect. But in addition, we're now into a much more neoliberal, privatized military that's still wasting enormous treasure. And of course, it's driving up the debt, so you pay interest on the debt from all the wars, particularly when you drive down taxes for the wealthy and allow them to make out like bandits. And these are the new kinds of privatized firms that have come, that have begun to fight these wars. In fact, we had more contractors in Iraq than we had military personnel. And we were paying them big bucks. Okay, no more. Yes, continuing. So, the guns and butter trade-off, basically that Eisenhower was predicting, has actually been guns trump butter. And there is the cost of keeping one soldier in for a year, for $1 million. And the number falling below the poverty line has swollen to 1 in 7. And this is the Bob Woodward quote that I talked about a little bit earlier. Continuing. And this is this resistance to change. Okay. That was always going to get continuing. One more. And again, just to reemphasize, there are certainly lots of ways in which we can influence our legislators. But I think we need to really find other ways to begin to reverse our reliance on the military-industrial complex. And this was put together, some of it was by Colleen McKay, a member with me, and the Historians Against the War. Most of it's adapted from Andrew Bacevich's article in the Atlantic Monthly, an earlier one, but you can read more of the recent stuff of Andrew Bacevich online. So thank you very much. I want to encourage you to do some more of that reading. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than willing to listen to some of the questions. Yes.
Wasn't regime change a big part of this military conflict? Did it start with Eisenhower?
It actually started with the OSS and the CIA in the 1940s. Regime change meant that if there was a country that in any way threatened what was seen as the free market, free world approach of the United States, that country might be due for a coup. So in 53, in Iran, 54, in Guatemala, an effort was done in an attempt at Bay of Pigs operation in 1961 in Cuba, and on and on and on. Yes. Yes.
Eisenhower's mother was a pacifist, and I read that Eisenhower's brother wrote that in Ike's final years, last few years, he had become completely a pacifist.
Yeah, it's interesting. He has this running through him. He opposed the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said we didn't have to drop that damn thing. You know, there was a real split in the military and ruling circles about whether or not to drop the other bomb. That doesn't mean, again, you know, because once he was in office, he gave free rein to, you know, his Secretary of Defense, who was then, if you remember, Wilson from General Motors. Who the business of America is, business. So the military-industrial corporation just, you know, ramped up its policies, and he oversaw a number of CIA coups, and so there is that split. There was certainly that part of his thread of his past, and it probably reaffirmed itself when he left office in this incredible speech in 1961. Other comments, questions? Yes.
You mentioned we should be active as people, but you didn't tell us what other than influence our legislators. What else can we do?
Well, you know, here are some of the great things that Colleen Mills has been able to produce. I think that she has a whole raft of opportunities in this wonderful little pamphlet about how to go ahead and influence you know, congressional people, how to, I was in the 1960s and early 70s, I was in an organization called the Honeywell Project, when Honeywell was producing the anti-personnel fragmentation bombs for Vietnam. We used to, you know, we would leaflet all the factories. We would tell people that we didn't want to take away their jobs. We just wanted to transfer their jobs from making weapons to doing something, you know, like public transportation or other kinds of systems that would be valuable to people. So there are a variety of opportunities, and you know, again, Colleen is the real expert on this. Just a pretender when it comes to suggesting things. I mean, that's part of the problem of just being a historian, looking back at the past. But I think there, you know, again, there are a variety of things that one can always do. Particular campaigns, Peace Action is very active in trying to establish and understand where the money goes. Rich can maybe talk a little bit about it. Right?
There are,
He doesn't need a mic.
He's got a booming voice from being a minister all those years.
Right.
there are ordinarily three budgets that come into Congress at this time of the year. The President's budget, the Republican budget, and from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the People's budget, which is better than the other two by the far means. Now what's happening this year is the Republicans can't get their act together, so far they have had to postpone several times when they introduce their budget, and that may not happen, which means the People's budget won't get a chance on the floor of the House. Last year, the people's budget got about 96 votes, including votes from John Conyers and Brenda Lawrence and Debbie Dingell. It did not get a vote from Sandra Levin or Dan Kildee, the other two Democrats. So if budgets come up, the people's budget, you can find that on the internet. It's very important to contact the Democrats about it. We have no chance with the Republicans, but that's very, very important. It redirects Pentagon spending. It zeroes out the war budget, OCO, which is basically a slush fund. And it is able to create lots of jobs in repairing infrastructure and actually putting money specifically for Flint in the millions of dollars is in the people's budget. So it gets very concrete. And we could probably put more information via the emails and so forth. Keep your eyes open for the people's budget.
How does the people's budget compare to the president's budget?
Well, the president's budget, for example, in terms of war, okay, it takes the money from the Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO, and puts it into the regular Pentagon budget. Whereas the people's budget just zeroes it out, period. Okay? And what's going on is the modernization of the nuclear force. So, for example, they'd like to build 12 new nuclear submarines to take the place of what there is now. Well, the people's budget says maybe 8. Okay? So it has very different kinds of priorities. Let me just say, connected to that, Secretary of State Kerry has been in Hiroshima, maybe preparing the way for Obama to go to Hiroshima. That would be tremendous. Okay? He's fallen behind his pledge to create a world free of nuclear weapons. Okay? And he's gotten trapped into modernizing it. He did that in order to get the START Treaty passed. However, if there is public pressure on Obama to go to Hiroshima in the next couple of months when there's a meeting, or on August 6th, that would be unbelievable. That would be a sea change. So, let everybody know Obama needs to get back on the elimination of nuclear weapons track, and that's a good way to do it.
If you could go to Cuba.
If you could go to Cuba, yeah.
More questions or comments?
Yeah. Have you read the recent article in The Atlantic about Obama? It's a 20-page article. Have you read it yet?
I haven't had a chance to read it.
Okay. I wanted your opinion, but you can't see. I thought it was excellent, just excellent.
Thank you. And let's give Fran a big hand.